Introduction to data validation techniques. Data validation is an Excel feature used to control what a user can enter into a cell. For example, you could use data validation to make sure a value is a number between 1 and 6, make sure a date occurs within the next 30 days, or make sure a text entry is no more than a specific number of characters. In this video, we will look at demonstrating data validation controls, understanding the data validation dialog box, modifying existing data validation controls, creating data validation from scratch, and working with lists. Let's look at some examples of data validation. On this worksheet, there are 6 cells, each with a different data validation control. When selecting the ID code cell, we see that an input message appears. This can be dragged to another location should it be obscuring parts of the worksheet. The input message suggests that the number of characters to be entered must be exactly 9 characters in length. So what would happen if the number of characters entered were not 9? Upon entering the value, an error alert window appears stating that the value does not match the data validation restrictions defined for the cell. The options retry, cancel, and help are offered as choices. Both the retry and cancel commands return you to the cell, but retry reselects the invalid data, whereas cancel removes the invalid data. Typically, help always takes you to the Microsoft website for assistance. Therefore, we'll say no more about this command for the remainder of this video. We'll choose the cancel command to remove the invalid data. When selecting the uppercase cell, we see that the input message has not been enabled. The implication of the cell's title is that only capitals are allowed. Upon entering a value which does not meet the criteria, we see the error alert window once again. We'll choose cancel. When selecting the task status cell, again, no input message is displayed. There is a drop-down arrow to the right of the cell which, when clicked, displays a list of allowed values, selectable by pointing and clicking. Entering a value not on this list results in the error alert window appearing once more. We'll choose cancel again. When selecting the date cell, the input message appears suggesting that the date must be in a date format. Entering something clearly not a date results in the error alert window and we'll once more choose cancel. When selecting the time cell, again an input message is displayed. Entering something which is not a time produces the error alert window once more, and again we'll choose cancel to remove the invalid entry. Finally, we'll select the value cell. This input message suggests only whole numbers within the range of 1 to 50 are valid. So far we've seen that an invalid entry produces a very standard error alert window. However, for this cell, the window has been customized. Let's enter the invalid entry and find out what the customized window looks like. The choices of commands remains unchanged, but the accompanying message is considerably different. We'll also abandon this entry by choosing cancel. Before examining how these 6 cells have been modified, let's look at the options available in the data validation dialog box. This can be found within the data ribbon in the Data Tools group. The dialog box has 3 tabs: Settings, Input Message, and Error Alert. The Settings tab is where you enter validation criteria. Any value means no validation is performed. Whole number, as the name suggests, means only whole numbers are allowed. Once the whole number option is selected, other options become available to further limit input. For example, you can limit the range of values to be a whole number between 1 and 10. Decimal works just like the whole number option, but allows decimal values. For example, with the decimal option configured to allow values between 0 and 5, values like 0.5, 2.5 and 3.1 are all allowed. List allows only values from a predefined list. The values are presented to the user within a drop-down list. Allowed values can be hard-coded directly into the Settings tab or specified as a range on any worksheet. Date only allows valid dates. For example, you can limit the date range to between the 1st of January 2018 and the 31st of December 2021, or a date on or after the 1st of June 2018. Time only allows valid times. For example, you can limit the time range to between 9 AM and 5 PM, or only allow times after 12 PM. Text length validates input based on the number of characters or digits. For example, you could ensure a code contains exactly 5 digits. Finally, custom validates user input using a custom formula. In other words, you can write your own formula to validate input. If the formula equals true, then the criteria has been met. If false, then the entry is invalid. The Input Message tab defines a message to display when a cell with validation rules is selected. This input message is completely optional. If no input message is set, no message appears when a user selects a cell with data validation applied. The input message has no effect on what the user can enter. It simply displays a message to let the user know what is allowed or expected. The Error Alert tab controls how validation is enforced. Stop stops users from entering invalid data in a cell. Users can retry but must enter a value that passes data validation. The Stop Alert window has two options: retry and cancel. Warning warns users that the data is invalid. The warning does nothing to stop invalid data. The Warning Alert window has three options: yes to accept invalid data, no to edit invalid data, and cancel to remove the invalid data. Information informs users that the data is invalid. This message does nothing to stop invalid data. The Information Alert window has two options: OK to accept invalid data and cancel to remove it. Let's see how the data validation was applied to these cells, and whilst doing so, make some further modifications to the criteria. We'll start with the ID code cell, which we can see is set to allow only 9 characters. We'll change this so that any number of characters up to and including 9 are valid. This can be achieved by changing the data drop-down to less than or equal to. The input message should also change to reflect this. The Error Alert style will remain as stop with no customized text. We'll click the OK button and test the entry by entering less than 9 characters and then greater than 9 characters. Next, the uppercase cell. This has a custom formula set to determine the entry's validity. If lowercase characters are entered anywhere within the cell, then the formula returns the answer of false, meaning that the entry is invalid. However, what if the cell were for a person's last name, which contains a lowercase character? We see that entering one such name is declared as invalid. But can we somehow allow this? We'll now change the Error Alert style from stop to warning. Entering an invalid entry still displays a message, but one of the options is yes, which would allow the entry to be accepted. The Task Status cell requires another choice to be added to the list. We see that the current choices in the source box are each separated by a comma. We will add a comma and deferred to the end of this. After clicking to confirm, we see that the new choice now appears on the drop-down list. The Date cell only allows a valid date. We will now change this to allow dates only within the next 30 days. This can be achieved by changing the data drop-down to between, changing the start date to the current date using the today function, and then changing the end date to 30 days after the current date. The input message is amended to feature 4 Ys rather than 2, and the change is confirmed. The Time cell only allows a valid time less than or equal to 23:59. We will now change this to allow for any time. we will change the data drop-down to greater than or equal to and the start time to 0, which can be entered as either 0 or 0:00. The value cell will be changed to allow for any value between 1 to 50 rather than just whole numbers. We will change allow to decimal. The input message will need changing to reflect this. Finally, if the entry is invalid, we will just inform of this by changing the error alert style to information. The customized error message will need changing to reflect this. After confirming, we see that an invalid entry could be accepted by selecting OK or rejected by selecting Cancel. On this worksheet, a formula has been placed under the total chargeable column, which calculates the length of a task. To ensure the data entered for task start is valid, data validation will be used to restrict entries to only a time between 0 and 23:59. We will select the task start cells and go to the data validation command. On the Settings tab, we will set the allowed entry to be a time between 0 and 23:59. No input message is required and the default for the error alert style is stop, so we will confirm this. We will now restrict the task end range to be between the task start time and 23:59. We will select the task end cells and go to the data validation command. On the Settings tab, we will again set the allowed entry to be a time. For the start time, we will point at whatever is in cell C10. Why cell C10? The active cell is currently within row 10. By pointing the start time at the relative position of one cell to the left of the active cell, this means that all other cells in this range will check the start time for their particular row. The end time is set to 23:59. The input message and error alert tabs are left unchanged and the validation is confirmed. We will test this by entering a task start time of 9 o'clock in the morning and a task end time of 2 o'clock in the afternoon. However, let's see what would happen if 2 o'clock in the afternoon is entered as 200 hours rather than 1400 hours. An error message is displayed due to the task end time being earlier than the task start time. Entering the task end time as 1400 hours is valid and the task length of 5 hours is displayed. In one of the earlier examples, a drop-down list was produced from values directly entered in the Settings tab of the Data Validation dialog box. In this example, the values to be used are instead on the worksheet. We wish to select departments for the 4 staff members. This list will use the 5 departments listed. We'll select the department cell for Atkinson. After clicking the Data Validation command and selecting List from the Allowed list, the source will be selected by highlighting the 5 departments on the worksheet. The Input Message tab and Error Alert tabs are left as their defaults. After clicking on the OK button to confirm, a drop-down arrow appears next to the cell and by selecting it, the list items are displayed. There are, however, some issues to be aware of. If I were to select an entry from the list, such as Human Resources, and later change Human Resources to HR in the cells where the list resides, this will have no effect upon entries already entered as Human Resources. All this would achieve is to make HR a valid entry and Human Resources an invalid one. Also, be aware that if you were to copy and paste a value from a cell without data validation into a cell with data validation, the cell might lose that data validation. Currently, the drop-down list only appears for Atkinson, and we would like it to also be available for Rhys-Jones, Smith and Stevenson. By selecting all the department cells for the 4 individuals and then clicking the Data Validation command, the command recognizes that there is data validation in at least one of the selected cells and offers the opportunity to extend this validation. By selecting Yes, all the selected cells now have the same data validation. This is confirmed by selecting OK from the dialog box. The Department of Facilities is now to be added to our list. Unfortunately, due to being outside of the defined range of cells for the list, it does not automatically appear on the drop-down list. In this example worksheet, 4 adjacent cells have the same data validation, so we could select all 4 cells and make a modification very easily. However, let's assume that we do not know which cells have the same validation, and we'd like to ensure that all these cells are modified. After clicking on one of the cells and then selecting the data validation command, by ticking the Apply these changes to all other cells with the same settings box, all the relevant cells are selected and any confirmed changes apply to that selection. Thank you for watching.